Hi, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today for this 5-part presentation on specialized intervention and advocacy for students with dyslexia. This is going to be the first part of a 5-part series answering the 5 W's of dyslexia. So most importantly, I want to thank you guys for choosing this, to take your time to invest in this. Our kids need a voice. They are widely underserved, and the lack of education about dyslexia is just too widespread to ignore. I'm here because my passion is sharing my dyslexia knowledge to others so that they can educate themselves, pass on knowledge, and advocate for these kids. It really feels like it's my life purpose, and I'm fortunate enough to do this every single day. I'm a veteran certified academic language therapist and a special educator, and I feel that there's a huge gap between parents' trust and understanding of the system and what the schools can and will do for their children. I've worked in both the public and private sectors, and I'm currently the owner of Dyslexia on Demand. We work nationwide serving children with dyslexia, and it provides me a unique perspective to the dyslexia climate state to state. I often feel amazed that I'm the person that I'm in the position that I'm in, having this company, and its success is in part a huge tribute to the need that's out there. Even though I am a seasoned dyslexia professional, I'm not going to pretend to be a researcher or an end-all be-all expert. What I can promise is that I am a boots on the ground expert, since this is what I do day in and day out on a national level. There's a place for all of us, and I'm proud to have been chosen for this role in the fight. All right. Please excuse a couple extra slides. I'm using this for a different presentation also that I'm giving live. So this morning, we're going to go back to my teacher roots and break this into a 5W structure, answering all the foundational issues with dyslexia. We're going to start with the why. Why do we have this literacy crisis? Even though it doesn't seem like it pertains to dyslexia, it actually very much does. Then we're going to go to what? What is dyslexia? Then when do we test? We're also going to talk about early screening and intervention here. Then who are the effective folks to turn to, and how do we measure their progress when we are doing this intervention? And finally, I had to fit in where. So we're going to, where are we going to be if we don't help fix our schools with their reading instruction and intervention issues? All right, so the first of our 5 W's is why. Why do we have a literacy crisis in the United States? Since dyslexia education primarily falls on the shoulders of the US public education system, it's important we understand the current status of literacy in the United States and the knowledge base of those handling our kids with dyslexia. It's important that we understand how they are providing these kids with instruction and intervention to understand a little more about why it is often unsuccessful. So let's start with some stats, and then we're going to move to the why behind those stats. So let's start with the stats related to the current plight of literacy instruction in the US for all of the kids. This may or not be common knowledge, but the most recent Nation's Report Card showed a staggering 68% of fourth graders read below the proficiency level. And this is important because it's a watershed year where data shows a correlation to high school graduation rates. And ultimately, you can see what it translates to as adults, with 63% of students graduating reading below reading proficiency and 43% of our US population considered functionally illiterate, which can be really hard to wrap your head around. Until a major shift occurs in the style of literacy instruction that we do, these poor rates are just going to continue. All of these poor instructional methods impact our society, with 54% of adults between the ages of 16 to 74 reading below a 6th grade level. And if you remember from that slide before, 40% of that 54% are considered functionally illiterate. So we're using some Nation's Report Card data Again, as you look at this, you can see that our numbers have not changed in the last 30 years. This graph is showing the average US score on the NAEP, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, on those approved state assessments. This is not a COVID bubble or anything we can attribute to COVID. COVID years are actually quite in line with the previous 30 years. These are for all our kids, those with and without that specific learning disability or dyslexia. This slide showing similar data, but presented by total children meeting the 4th grade proficiency standard. In the last 30 years, the highest level of students ranking at or above the 4th grade level is 37% for our nation. So I've got to ask, when this many kids are struggling, who's going to notice dyslexia, especially those mild cases? The ultimate goal of reading instruction is comprehension. We need to understand what we read, not only for reading to be enjoyable and not laborious, but to actually apply it as a critical life skill. But this data shows that consistently not enough children are achieving this, with the same percentage of 4th and 8th graders stating that they can confidently comprehend what they're reading. It's only 36%. Now we're going to focus specifically on kids with an SLD, or a specific learning disability. That's what that stands for. Remember that our kids who are supposed to already be, these are our kids who are supposed to already be receiving that individualized intervention on their campuses. Research shows students with an SLD can achieve commensurate with their peers if they're given appropriate instruction and support. But more than 95% of 4th through 8th grade students with an SLD are not proficient in reading. And if you're SLD and Black or Hispanic, you're that much worse off. So keeping our focus on kids with an SLD, and these drive home the importance of us realizing that there's a problem early on, before 4th grade. 75% of those 9-year-olds and older whose help are delayed will keep struggling. And this is meaning 4th grade. And that's if we catch them. 80% of students struggling in the 1st grade will continue to struggle in the 4th grade. And that really just kind of drives home that point that there's no point in allowing more time for them to develop reading before jumping in. But 90% is the best statistic for hope. 90% who are flagged or identified and receive that appropriate evidence-based tailored support that they need in 1st grade will reach grade level in reading. That just means early identification and intervention are so hugely critical. So what have we done as a nation to address this enormous issue? Well, way back in 2000, the National Reading Panel released a lot of data surrounding the 5 key concepts at the core of effective reading instruction, where they laid out the importance of structured literacy, which I'm going to speak about more in a second. But since this critical body of work was released, we really have had little to no change. President Bush started to address these concerns with No Child Left Behind in 2001, but it didn't build steam and took a bit of a back seat during September 11th. Of course, we're all familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but by 2018, parents had taken action. They were tired of what was going on, and all 50 states had established a Decoding Dyslexia chapter. That's that powerhouse grassroots parent organization that impacts most of the change. And then one of the most valuable things of late, the creation of the Soul to Story podcast by Emily Hanford through American Public Media, where she lifted the veil to the general public about the current methods of reading instruction in our schools. It is a very powerful podcast, work of art, in effect, and I recommend that you check it out if you're not familiar with it. It came out in 2022, and this triggered a whole lot of media about the literacy plight. So where's the breakdown? 2/3 of our nation's children cannot be special education. Here's my synopsis. Structured literacy, which I'm about to go deeper into, has not ever really been included in university level classes. Balanced literacy approach is all that has been instructed, if anything. That is starting to change in some states, but it's not widespread enough. In fact, At the core of it, I am a certified elementary education teacher, and never once was I taught how to teach a child to read, not one class. And dyslexia was never once mentioned. And when I speak with recent graduates of elementary education degrees, it's the same story. Literacy instruction is not on the job training. It's an intricate process that takes skill and study. On the job training is balanced literacy because it comes from the delivery of these big box curriculums. On the same note, the majority of our US schools literacy curriculum is not based in the science of reading or research. It's based on these balanced literacy and big box publishing companies. And how does this impact our kids with dyslexia? That's what we're all here for. Well, it's huge. Teachers aren't even trained on what dyslexia is or how to recognize it. Consistent quality universal screeners for dyslexia aren't being used in schools despite some states' legislation. And parents do not understand dyslexia and they trust the schools will lead. But if they don't even know about dyslexia and how to intervene, meaning the schools, this is a false assumption on the parents' part. So I had to throw this in for fun. I'm sure you've all seen this meme. But since the media got a hold of the information in 2022 with that Sold a Story podcast, several teachers are taking it upon themselves to learn more about why their instructional methods are broken. And more school administrators are adopting better curriculum based in the science of reading and structured literacy, but it still is way too few. As a professional who deals with many schools on a national level, I can see elements of this shift starting to happen, but it's slow. And I'm scared that this is going to lose momentum. And just for a timestamp, since this is recorded, I'm currently sitting on March 1st of 2024. No, March 2nd, but it's a moot point. Here's the biggest difference between balanced literacy and structured literacy. Balanced literacy is based on nothing but someone's philosophy versus research and science, and that's what structured literacy is based in. So what is structured literacy that I keep referring to, and how is it different than this other thing, balanced literacy, which is what the schools primarily use? In the next few slides, I'm going to give you an in-depth understanding of what it is and why it must be used for all students, but especially our ones with dyslexia. Reading is not a natural process. If reading was natural, we would not have a literacy in the society. The brain technically has to reorganize to support it. We have areas of the brain designed to support the relationship between auditory processing, phonological processing, and speech, and then we use those to link to print. You're born with a brain that can remember the pronunciation of a word and the meaning. And as you connect the pronunciation and the meaning of a word with its spelling, you create new neural pathways that allow you to remember written words. Once a typically developing reader has done this a few times, the written form of the word gets mapped into their memory. It's always there to retrieve. No sounding out or doing anything conscious to retrieve that word. And this is called orthographic mapping. You know the word because at some point you connected the pronunciation. And for some people, it's easy. A little exposure and they can do this. But for a lot of kids, making the connection between print and speech is pretty hard. They need someone to teach them how to do it. They need explicit, detailed instruction, meaning structured literacy. And this is important. How a person is taught impacts different areas of the brain and which ones you pull from. And you want to use the parts of the brain that will be most effective in how you map those words long term. That way, you're using your brain power to understand what you're reading versus sounding it out. And I'm sure you all heard this term by now, but in a nutshell, the science of reading is scientific reading instruction, and it's what structured literacy is based on. It's a big body of research that incorporates insights and research from many disciplines: developmental psychology, educational psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. The science of reading has been documented all over the world in all languages and cultures and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. In short, it demonstrates methods that best help children learn to read, from the earliest moments of spoken language to being able to successfully decode unfamiliar words. And it's based in the big 5 ideas core to effective reading instruction: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocab, and comprehension. What is it not? It's not a fad or a pendulum swing or something created by a big company to sell curriculum. It's an ever evolving body of research that we need to base all of our instruction and teacher education in. So this book was published in 1955, and it's evidence of how long there have been reading wars. It was written 70 years ago. But this could have been written this year. It really vindicates everything in the science of reading and such a testament of proof to the misguidance of balanced literacy by the big publishing companies for so many years. So, in effect, we took so many steps back in between now and then. It's too bad Emily Hanford wasn't around in 1955. So breaking structured literacy down further, we are intentionally teaching the structure of language, from the sound system of language through to syntax. And as we move past decoding and language structure, we're deliberately teaching text organization that can contribute to effective writing structure and comprehension. It teaches the why and the rules of the English language in a systematic building fashion, reading tied through spelling or through writing. The National Reading Panel published 2000 data that 60% of our readers need this level of instruction in order to acquire skilled reading. And I love this graphic because it clearly breaks that 2000 National Reading Panel panel data down visually. Remember that 60% that I was referring to. So in kindergarten, there's about 5% of kids who are just going to show up reading. It really seemed effortless. They acquired it with complete ease. 35% will grasp reading just from broad instruction and exposure. Those are those kids who never hit that low reading group or anything other than tier 1. But the rest of our kids, and that's a whopping 60%, need structured literacy. They need the why behind instruction, either because they're dyslexic or unidentified dyslexic, or their brains need more layering and explicit instruction. They're those horses that need to be led to water to drink a little more. And here's a side-by-side of balanced literacy, what is predominantly used in schools, and structured literacy, instruction based on research. The main points of balanced literacy approach are that phonics instruction is extremely limited. It doesn't happen for nearly long enough or explicitly enough. And this means reading through spelling. No why or rule-based instruction is occurring, no sequential logical order, etc. Also, the focus is much more on the meaning of text versus the accuracy of what is read. Of course, we need both. The 3 cueing method is deeply ingrained into balanced literacy. But what's so important to take away from the left-hand side is that this is not working. Structured literacy is based in the science of reading, rule-based, purposeful scope and sequence, continual reinforcement of skill and concept, and those essential buzzwords: explicit, systematic, and sequential. Students improve in their reading by learning and practicing the code of reading. We teach the why, but this isn't just a new teacher's manual. There is in-depth study and training required, so teacher requirements and education are going to need to have a huge overhaul, and it is going to involve legislation. So I just mentioned the 3 cueing method, and this is still one of the backbones of balanced literacy, excuse me, and what is still the primary method used in current instruction. The cues are: first, look at the picture. Second, look for clues in the word or around the word. In fact, that means context, right? So is pictures. And then number 3, ask yourself if it would make sense. And then the last step is to decode as a last resort. This is taught in those early formidable years of K through 2. And after that, it's just what kids' brains have adopted. And then they just apply these bad habits to larger words and text. They're very prone to errors, substitutions, and omissions, which ultimately impact their comprehension. Many states like Arkansas and Louisiana have banned curriculum that uses 3 cueing, and Texas just proposed legislation to do so. So it's so ingrained in those teachers, it's a hard habit to break. But A 2019 survey of teachers showed that 75% still used it in instruction. We are sitting in 2024. I'd like to think that decreased, but from a lot of things that I am personally seeing, I am not hugely reassured that that percentage has dropped too significantly. Here's an example of why it's important to understand structured literacy. This is my darling daughter, Pepper. She's now in 2nd grade, but at her kinder parent-teacher conference, and I always say, bless that sweet teacher who had to have me sitting there analyzing her. And the teacher wants Pepper to show off her newly found reading skills. Now, at this point, she's in a level B reader, which is very low, obviously the step above A. And we come to the word mother, which should not be in that book since it's not decodable for a kindergartner. But heads up, non-decodable words are very common due to the text in these big box curriculums. They have an expectation for 3Qing. So she prompts her on the 3 Qs. Look at the picture, look for clues in the word or around the word, and ask yourself if it made sense. And Pepper just can't get it, so we're left to decode. So when you sound out the word mother like a kindergartner would do it, ready? Ah, t, eh, er. Now, if you blend that together, it makes no sense. Mother is not a decodable word for a kindergartner since they're not equipped with that level of systematic phonics instruction yet. They haven't been taught digraph TH yet. They haven't been taught R-controlled vowels. And never once do I think I've ever seen scribble O in any curriculum. But that teacher didn't know enough about phonics to notice to not tell Pepper to try and sound it out. This also shows you what cueing means and why it's wrong. Ultimately, these techniques are making our kids feel unsuccessful since it's a game of 20 questions that isn't effective. Imagine the perspective of Pepper at level B, and she can't be successful unless she memorizes the word. And mother has no business being in a B level book. But ultimately, as I asked in my son's IEP meeting literally 2 weeks ago, why are they still using these level literacy books to determine progress? It really doesn't mean squat. So this is such a great visual since it helps you to see what the kids are up against in balanced literacy. Level text is more of the same, and it forces memorization. It forces to operate for the brain, in effect, to operate like the dyslexic brain. Structured literacy builds in a systematic fashion that properly builds skill and confidence. So a word like mother would not show up in structured literacy decodable text until you had direct instruction and all the skills needed to decode that word, which I just went through. But also we would have to add in their syllabication. Here's a piece of balanced literacy we all know and many kids still think is gospel. When 2 vowels go walking, the first one does the talking. But the truth is that the first one does the talking only 32% of the time. That's a third of the time. How's that for effective instruction? So now that you know how to recognize it, I know that a lot of these names are going to sound very common to you, like guided reading, reading recovery, and that dreaded F&P letter system of leveled literacy intervention. BAS is another way that it's referred to in F&P. But old habits die hard, and these are still used in most schools, including my own kid's school. And we're in Texas, and we have some of the better legislation surrounding this. Texas has legislation that forced teachers to go to reading academies that span 11 months to learn the elements of structured literacy. But then they go back to their campuses where they often have a balanced literacy curriculum adoption that they have to use, so their hands are tied. You see how it's such a broken system, no matter how strong the state is. Dr. Matthew Burns of the University of Florida, and the University of Florida is a leader in this type of research, found that until he tried to study F&P, that the tests had never been done, meaning that F&P had never been independently validated to see how closely its results aligned with other reading assessments. The only studies had come internally from Fountas and Pinnell, or in other words, F&P. His research showed that it could only distinguish proficient and struggling readers about half of the time. So in essence, we could test all these kids and each teacher take about 30 minutes to do it per child, or we could flip a coin and it would be just about as inaccurate. And when it comes to those who need the most intensive support, it only identified them 31% of the time. Burns said that it was quite literally the lowest he has ever seen. Yet it is still used today in about 1 out of every 6 elementary schools. And guess what I got from my school about my son a few weeks back? You guessed it, F&P based literacy system growth, letter growth. As a professional, I know that this doesn't really mean a whole hill of beans. When a child memorizes 10 words, they get to read 10 words. And they don't feel confident to try to decode words based on skills since they are so used to reading by memorization. If you teach them 10 sounds and give them text that supports that ability, they can read a total of 26,320 words. It needs to be more widely understood that reading is rocket science. It's more complex than many in the educational community understand. Our brains literally need to reorganize to support reading by connecting the pronunciation, meaning, and spelling of the word. And if we don't instruct this properly, the wrong part of the brain takes over, lending to poor reading and ultimately poor spelling. That whole language or balanced literacy approach of years ago is not what our children need. We have the responsibility of teaching children to read and write using science-based instruction. But we're fighting a system here. Cueing strategies and balanced literacy is deeply ingrained into the public education system. And it seems as easy as just reading the research and switching, right? Why hasn't everybody done this? But we're naive to think that the results of a collection of studies called the science of reading would be more persuasive than a publishing company's sales teams. Schools aren't reading the research. And if they have caught on to the new hype, they haven't bought that right curriculum or researched what that right curriculum is. And once they adopt a curriculum, they need to keep it a while since it's a matter of money. Needing the superintendent to also know and care about the research to buy something new is really important. And then we have that issue of the fact that the teachers haven't been trained on how to properly execute it. I am part of so many Facebook groups, structured literacy Facebook groups, and these are the teachers that care and that they're trying to do right. And the questions that come up show how little training that they have had in balanced literacy and how to properly implement it. So it feels confusing to them. Balanced literacy doesn't take training, but structured literacy really does to be effective. And skilled word reading is not a detective game. Structured literacy approaches teach students the intricate foundation of how to decode a word, explicit letter patterning and syllabification to their so their brains can ultimately map the word and then recognize it instantly. And good readers are taught to process every letter to relay what it says. And using context, such as what balanced literacy teaches, research shows is effective only 1 in 4 times. Okay, so why have I spent so much time on this? Because it doesn't just impact our neurotypical readers. It hugely impacts our kids with dyslexia. Our kids with dyslexia are receiving this type of instruction both in the classroom and in their small group intervention from their IEP minutes. They aren't even working from a solid foundation. Their house is being built and reinforced with straw. Because balanced literacy approaches half the equation that's needed for dyslexia intervention for kids. For our borderline babies, especially if we teach them reading initially like this, we can really help to move the needle enough for them possibly not to suffer the same. So if you take anything away from all these slides, it's that when you're representing kids with dyslexia, we need to first learn how the schools are teaching and providing intervention for these kids. What instructional method are they using? What curriculum are they using? Is it based in balanced literacy or is it based in structured literacy? That will tell us a lot about the chance of their intervention minutes being successful. Another piece is how well someone is trained, but we're going to get to that in the 4th part of this presentation. Since we've named so many bad curriculums, here are some great structured literacy curriculum adoptions that students can implement in their gen ed classes K through 2 to make an enormous difference for all of their kids, dyslexic and neurotypical. It will support that 60% that research shows needs the explicit instruction. And once you know the name of the curriculum the campus has adopted, you can review them on edreports.org or the Center for Intensive Instruction and learn more about that curriculum's efficacy. Schools have got to change, and change is scary and overwhelming. It will feel like turning around the Titanic, but the old way is not the right way. We need to stop teaching them the one hand tied behind your back reading strategy. Schools need to have a growth mindset and realize that this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. We need these teachers trained in the principles of structured literacy. And this is just one of my absolute favorite meme. I don't know if this is a meme, but never let a broken system convince you you have a broken child. So thank you so much for tuning in to this part of the presentation. Again, this was part 1 in a 5-part series of the 5 W's of dyslexia, covering everything to do with dyslexia, from the broken literacy system all the way through what is what is dyslexia, when do we intervene, who is qualified, etc. So please go to dyslexiaondemand.com to download the next part of this webinar. Thank you so much.